Hello and welcome to week 21 of World History. We'll dive right into it as we have three pretty interesting lessons this week. We're going to start this week in the field of philosophy. René Descartes is the first person we'll talk about, and one of the great thinkers of the Age of Reason, really kind of ushered in for a lot of people the Age of Reason, that transition we've been talking about from the Renaissance. He us from France, and was apparently very sick as a child, had lots of maladies and stayed inside a lot. As a result, he read a lot of books and did a lot of thinking, and it showed. He, much like some of the others that we've talked about during the Middle Ages and during the Renaissance, particularly during the Renaissance, he wondered if mathematics held the answers to all of the unexplainable things in the universe. Doesn't mean he was atheistic, he was not, but he was fascinated enough with mathematics and physics to wonder if somewhere in these disciplines can the unexplained be explained. He contributed a lot to what we call analytic geometry, a step of mathematics. It's somewhere between algebra and calculus. It seeks to measure things and break them down. It falls short of calculus in some respects in terms of just overall difficulty, but he came up with the Cartesian coordinate system. And if you've ever plotted things on an XY graph, which is very standard, he's the first one to really do that. He saw that as a way to measure movement, place, and time, and it was so elementary, it's amazing someone hadn't really thought of it before. But to use the XY coordinate system quickly became a standard, and much to many math students' chagrin, is still used today. He joined the army for a time, moved around. He settled in the Netherlands in 1628. The Inquisition was suspicious of some of the sciences he was writing about, so he kind of moved from place to place to avoid coming into conflict with the church. But his biggest contribution came in the way he fused mathematics, physics, and philosophy. We talked about Sir Francis Bacon a little bit earlier. He was big on philosophy, not a great mathematician, but very fond of math. Descartes took him a step further. He applied mathematics to philosophy to try to explain the unexplainable. And during this portion of the video, I'm throwing up just some random quotes from Descartes. The one you should remember, the one he is most known for, is, "I think, therefore I am." One of the most well-known phrases in philosophical history, and basically Descartes is arguing that because he bears the capacity to think, he exists. Seems kind of simplistic enough, but it's actually a deep philosophical question. Do I exist? Is this reality? And for Descartes, the idea that I, as a person, can think independently of anything else, I exist. For whatever that means. That standard is called Descartesian philosophy even today. He found his fellow French intellects to be skeptical, and you can certainly see during this time of history where thousands and thousands of people are dying because of the way they do religion. You could see how someone could become a skeptic. Descartes disagreed with the skeptics. The skeptics were those that, unlike the people of the Renaissance, looked back at the Greek and Roman philosophers and said, well, how smart could they have been? They had no knowledge of this new world we're talking about. They had not experienced the scientific breakthroughs that we have, so maybe, they're not all that smart. Well, Descartes disagreed with that. He said that there were some things that were certain, no matter what point of history they were brought up in. Universal constants is the term I've always used. He believed that he could doubt everything he saw around him, but he could not deny his own existence. If he doubted he existed, then he didn't exist. but he knew he existed because, why? Because he could think about it. Cogito ergo sum is, I think, therefore I am in Latin, if you want to sound really smart about it. Since I am thinking, I exist. And to Descartes, his own existence was the first block of all philosophy. If none of this is real, if you're not real, then none of it really matters, does it? The idea of man being the start of all things is a very humanistic practice, but Descartes believed that God had to exist because a good God would never create man to think God existed if God didn't exist. Think about that for a while. Because man exists, Descartes believes there is a God. Now, his particular religion, we don't really know. He didn't talk much about that. But he was at least a deist. He did believe in the existence of a God, unlike a lot of other philosophers who kind of prided themselves on their atheism. Descartes also is famous for the idea of dualism, or the separation of the body and the mind. He saw them as two very distinct things. And I think the way we view things today, we kind of separated the heart and the mind, the physical and the metaphysical, the things that we can see and the things we cannot see. Descartes really pushed this idea of dualism, saying that both of them are legitimate, both of them do exist, both of them are a thing, and they should be certainly respected as existing. He suggested that the body, or the things we sense, is different from what our minds know. He called to the example of a candle, of wax in particular. If you look at it in one state, it appears to be solid. If you look at it in another state, it appears to be liquid. So what your senses are telling you is different than what your brain is telling you. Your brain knows that this is wax, and when it's a certain temperature, it will become a liquid. But if you were to rely just on your senses, you would have an incomplete view of what wax is. He promoted what's called methodical reasoning of the mind, or logical deduction, to understand the world that we live in. Since the senses himself, as he pointed out with the wax example, cannot be trusted independently of each other. I hope you've had a chance to look at some of the random quotes I've thrown up from Descartes. Really, some of the standard philosophical foundation of Western civilization. Smart fellow. He was able to fuse the worlds of philosophy and mathematics like no one before him. All right, we're going to go back to some more New World exploration, and you'll recall we talked last week about the Pilgrims that landed on Plymouth Rock in 1620, the first permanent English settlement in what would later be called the New England area. Another group followed them hard on their heels. Remember, we were talking earlier about the difference in the Anglican Church between the Puritans and the Separatists. The Puritans wanted to purify the church. They saw the church as worthy of saving, that if they could go in and root out all these Catholic elements that were kind of lingering around in the church. Remember, the Anglican Church was a compromise effort from Queen Elizabeth. She wanted to form a church that would appeal to both Protestants and Catholics, and ended up creating a church that appealed to very few of either group. The Puritans thought that the church was still salvageable if they could remove a lot of these Catholic papal elements from the Anglican Church. The Separatists saw the church as beyond saving. Now, the Pilgrims that we talked about last week were largely separatists. They had no interest in trying to revive the Anglican Church. But there was a growing number of Puritans who were really, really trying to make the Anglican Church pure, 100% Protestant, that is. Well, remember, the king at the time was king after Elizabeth was James I, then Charles I. They were both Scottish Catholics, and they liked the Catholic part of the Anglican Church, and they saw the Puritans as a big, big headache. And both of them, despised the Puritans for trying to tamper with the Anglican Church, and really persecuted them at every opportunity. The Puritans sincerely hoped that moving to the New World would help them build what they would saw as a pure church that would maybe influenced the church back in England to change its ways and become pure as well. They got a charter from King Charles, which had to be the easiest decision he ever made. You got, 700 Puritans coming up and say, hey, we want to go to the New World. Fine, get you out of my hair. Go. He formed the Massachusetts Bay Company, and they planned to settle in a little fishing village that had been established by other colonists in Salem, Massachusetts, about 50 miles north of where the Pilgrims had landed. This was in the year 1630, so 10 years after the Pilgrims. So in 1630, those 700 Puritans boarded 11 ships under the leadership of John Winthrop. He would be their governor for 20-some plus years, a very influential leader, very popular leader with the Puritans. After 72 days at sea, they finally entered the harbor of Salem and were shocked to find nothing more than just some huts on the beach. This was a fishing village that was not ready for 700 traveled, beaten people. The former governor explained to John Winthrop that disease and starvation had killed 80 of the first settlers of the fishing village. Out of about 250, only 85 of them remained. So they were really having a hard time weathering, quite literally, the New World. The Puritans, though, went to work, and one of the things that has lasted through the centuries is the recognition that this so-called Puritan work ethic was needed now more than ever. You'll recall in the Jamestown settlement, there were a whole lot of gentlemen that made the trip, and who saw farm work and manual labor as beneath them. They were there to find riches, gold, and whatnot. And so the Jamestown colony struggled quite a bit with those who were not willing to work. Well, the Puritans did not tolerate someone who was not going to work. They did not broach laziness whatsoever. The Puritans were very successful in Salem, so successful that they began to spread to other towns and villages. By September of that first year, John Winthrop had moved himself to a village a little bit further south of Springfield that he would name Boston. Perhaps you've heard of it. You've also probably heard of this little place near Boston called Harvard University. That was started in 1636, the first college established in the New World, and it was started for training young men in the ministry. Of course, Harvard is still around today, and you have probably heard of it. It is one of the elite colleges, not only in the U.S., but in the world. By the year 1642, there were more Puritans that were hearing about these great things that were happening in the New World, and this new church that they were creating that was pure in their eyes. And by 1642, the villages that made up the Massachusetts Bay Colony were requiring parents to teach their young children to read so they would know the scriptures. Within a few years later, they decided that if a town had at least 50 families, they were required to hire a teacher. So in addition to being big on work, they were big on education. They had a markedly better experience with the natives than did, say, the Jamestown colony. We talked about how moody Chief Powhatan was. The Massachusetts Bay Colony had a much better track record with the natives in the New England area. And, matter of fact, the first Bible printed in the New World was printed in the Algonquin language by John Eliot. He was so intent on sharing the gospel of Jesus Christ that he spent years learning their speech and translating the Bible into the Algonquin language. So how weird is that? The first Bible printed in the New World was in Algonquin, not England. Anyway, 25,000 more Puritans arrived just 12 years after the founding of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. So their population increased 40-fold in just a little bit more than a decade. And so the Puritans had definitely made a beachhead in the New World. We're going to close out our lesson today talking about one of the most influential scientists in the Age of Reason, very much the heir apparent to Leonardo da Vinci in terms of absolute versatility. You've heard the name Galileo Galilei, just Galileo with his friends. Was born in Pisa, Italy, Leaning Tower of Pisa. Remember that. That'll come up in a second. He was a very precocious young man who became a very precocious adult and was a scientist, a mathematician, even a philosopher. He was so darn well-rounded that even the prose that he wrote was recognized as some of the best Italian writing of his generation. So very much multi-talented. His first major invention was something called the hydrostatic balance. It's an instrument that measures the specific gravity of objects in water. You've probably seen some of these glass cylinders with little bulbs of mercury and other substances, and how they float up and down. And if it's temperature is warmer, this one will rise and this one will sink. If it gets warmer, this one will rise and then this one will rise. That's a Galileo thermometer, and he's the one who invented that. And I've got one in my home, and it works perfectly. His first scientific law, was the law of falling bodies. Now remember, he lived in Pisa, the Leaning Tower of Pisa, and the legend goes that he used the Leaning Tower to test this theory. It is measuring how quickly objects fall to Earth based upon their mass. Now, whether or not he actually used the Tower of Pisa, that's only history knows that. But whatever the method, Galileo's point was made. In an airtight vacuum without wind or any other resistance, objects are drawn towards the Earth at the same rate. So in a vacuum, a feather will fall as fast as a steel marble. Of course, we have air, and that makes everything different. But if you remove air and any other impediment, just the force of gravity is going to bring those two objects down at the same rate. We talked about Francis Bacon and his attempt to marry the worlds of philosophy and mathematics. Well, Galileo was the one who conducted the ceremony. He was the one who absolutely married these two disciplines. He quantified and calculated the things he philosophized about. Studying things like parabolas and the law of squares, he related math to science more than anyone else before him. And as a result, he was big on the practical application of mathematics and science. So when you can put together a good practical application, you've got a philosophy and mathematic backup to buttress your assertions. In 1609, he found a way to improve the telescope. Not going to get into the science of how that happened, but suffice to say that Galileo's improvements to the telescope literally opened up the universe for explorers and astronomers. The new telescope under Galileo's design was strong enough to see stars that had never been seen before. It showed that the Milky Way was not just a blur in the sky, but rather a galaxy of stars, in Galileo's words, so numerous as to almost be beyond belief. He discovered 4 of the many moons of Jupiter with his newfangled and improved telescope, and he recognized through the 2 things about our moon with the telescope. First off, it's not smooth. The moon is full of craters and all kinds of ridges and even mountains. The new telescope showed the surface of the moon. It also proved other scientists' theories that the moon did not have light of its own. The light we see from the moon is actually the sun reflecting off the moon. He Not satisfied with that, 15 years later, he created the first compound microscope. And what the telescope did for exploration of the stars, the microscope did for exploration of germs. It would be, unfortunately, a couple hundred years before we were able to put a lot of the 2 and 2s together in terms of how to fully take advantage of this invention of the microscope. But Galileo was the first to introduce it. He used mathematics to improve the accuracy of cannons. Again, his style of writing about these things was admired just for his art and whatnot. We talked about Descartes moving and dodging around to avoid the Inquisition. Anytime you're putting forth these radical scientific theories at this point in history, you're going to draw the attention of the Church. Catholic Church, of course, was not as powerful as it was a couple of centuries ago, but it still had a lot of power, particularly in Italy, which was still largely Catholic at this point. Galileo, of course, like Copernicus, thought that the Earth revolved around the sun. We've talked about Copernicus insofar as he waited until he was very, very old to publish his theories. So by the time the church got around to banning them, he was already had one foot in the grave, and he didn't care. But in 1632, Galileo published what was called the Dialogue Concerning the Two Chief World Systems, and he made a strong case for the heliocentric theory. Now, he did not come out and say this is the way it is. He said the idea that the Earth revolves around the sun is a compelling theory. He knew it was true, but he didn't want to get in trouble with the church. But even suggesting it in a broad way drew the attention of the Inquisition. Galileo was put on trial for heresy in 1633, and the church basically urged him to present his heliocentric ideas as only a theory, only a hypothesis, and Galileo refused. He says it's more than a hypothesis. It's backed up by math and science. He was found guilty of heresy. In a measure of how, I don't want to say weak the church had become, maybe weak, but also maybe open-minded, how many heretics, quote-unquote heretics, have we talked about over these months who were found guilty of heresy by the Catholic Church, were beheaded, burned, whatever? Galileo was forced to write a recantation and kept under house arrest for the rest of his life. His works were banned by the church for about 200 years. Now that's bad, but it's not as bad as being beheaded or burned at the stake. Progress, I guess we could call it. The biggest progress, though, is here in the year 2023. We recognize Galileo's genius for what it was. He's considered the father of modern physics. He understood the principles of inertia. That is to say, the idea that things will keep going unless they're stopped by an outside force. And of course, his theories on inertia helped develop Isaac Newton's famous first law of motion. An object at rest will remain at rest until acted upon by an outside force. So Galileo begets Newton, who begets calculus, which makes space travel possible. It's all connected. Anyway, we'll talk more about it on Monday. See you then.